no podemos construir pasos de fauna, entonces es una buena forma y temas a considerar.
Okay, so I'll be talking about mitigation methods in a general sense. That is trying to look at both the effectiveness of a whole series of mitigation methods and also not only their effectiveness but how much they cost. So in other words, some things are actually fairly inexpensive, but they also don't work very well. Unfortunately, we find that in a lot of cases, right? So this is a sort of a survey of a number of different methods and how, in general, they work. And then Tony will also talk about more specifics about some mitigation measures. And then the second half of this three-part hour will be using behavior to help us to identify maybe what kinds of structures that animals will use. And then the third part is about fences and how we can look at some behavioral characteristics to help us understand that. And how's this mic now? It sounds like it's making kind of some noises. Is this okay? Okay. Okay, so this cost versus effectiveness issue, I'll talk about kind of four separate, I want to go back and give credit my colleague Julia Kinch, who's not here, but I want to give her credit for, we have worked on this presentation and others together for a number of years now, so she gets a lot of credit for that. So, and we've kind of gone back and forth of who gives it, but it's one of those many cases where you have people who are working together to come up with great ideas, so, or at least what we think are great ideas. Anyway, the first thing that we'll be talking about is retrofitting existing structures. So one thing we have out there on all roads is a lot of different culverts and bridges and even overpasses over highways in rural areas where there's maybe good habitat on both sides of the road. So are there some ways that we can look at those existing structures and maybe enhance them so that some wildlife will use them? The next category will be the actions that we can take that affect the drivers. So what can we do to change driver behavior to make it less likely that drivers will run into wildlife? The third category is what can we do to affect the way that wildlife act so that they are less likely to be hit by vehicles. And that also actually, that changing their behavior can also sometimes mean that you're enhancing their connectivity as well. And then a little bit with implementation and observation of what you've done. Like, how do you know if it's working or not? Okay, so if you're looking at all of the, really, literally, across the world, there are millions and millions of existing culverts and bridges. Every country has them. So how can we make them work better? Some of them are not going to work, but if we can take advantage of just a fraction of the ones that are already out there, then we've already made a dent in the problem, if not completely solving it. In other words, we may not have to design structures from scratch every single time. Maybe we can just take advantage of what's there and then improve it a little bit, and that will, maybe sometimes it will improve it a lot, or at least it will buy time before we can plan a new structure and put in something that's even better. So here's a flow chart that kind of walks us through what are some of the questions that we have that would help us to determine whether we could use an existing structure or not. Is there a necessity for animals to move across the road? Well, yes or no. If there's no need for them to move, which is, maybe the case in like cities or something, there are situations that way, then you can stop worrying about this. You don't have to, think about that anymore. But if the answer is yes, then the next question is there a structure already existing in this particular location where you want animals to move across the road? If there's no structure, then the only option you have is to design and build a new structure because there's nothing there that you can improve. On the other hand, if there is an existing structure, an existing bridge, an existing culvert, or some type of way for an animal to get across the road, then your next step is to evaluate that structure and look at it in terms of what types of groups of species or guilds of species might use that type of structure. And I will go into the guilds in the next presentation. And what are the characteristics of both the structure as well as the site? So in this case, then you want to look at if there are any fatal flaws in this structure. For example, if it's just there's no way to make it better for wildlife, then in that case, then you're probably going to have to put in a new structure. Just say, this was a good idea, but it's not going to work. If in that case, if it's an area where it's really important for wildlife to move, your only option is to then start over, have a new structure that's designed for wildlife passage. So if there's no fatal flaws, however, then there are some things that you can do to retrofit existing structures. And there's a paper that Julia Kinch, myself, and Patricia Kramer have written on how to use some of these concepts. But in general, these are just more of the categories of things you can do. You can, if there's obstacles in front of the, say, culvert, then you can remove the obstacles. This might be anything from too much vegetation so that your target species can't find the entrance. It might be that it's silted in and they can't see it or they can't get into the structure one way or the other. You might facilitate their movement by, for example, putting in some sort of a pathway that's dry. We'll see this in the field trip where there are some options to do that. The idea is to develop some type of a dry pathway for that some species like to walk on better than walking through water itself. That's one example. You can reduce the intimidation. So in that case, that one's a little bit harder to do because sometimes the intimidation can be things like people camping under the bridge. Or in a lot of places in the U.S., we have many homeless people that are living under bridges. So in that case, it might be a great bridge for wildlife to use. It might be in a perfect location, but if there's a lot of people there that are staying there the whole time, then that's going to be a problem. Now, obviously, that isn't a social issue that is way bigger than we're going to talk about today, but it is an example of an intimidation that can be changed somewhat. And then make access better. So if you can improve the way that animals get to it, for example, perhaps you can create a pathway, a trail that your target species could follow. It's interesting that we have found that sometimes if you create trails that, animals will say, oh, okay, I guess this is the way I'm supposed to go, and they'll follow it. And lo and behold, you've just led them to a place where they can cross. Again, these are just examples. There's a whole bunch of other things that you can think of yourself, probably. Let's see, next one is to either put diversion barriers or keep animals off the road with fencing. We'll talk about fencing a little bit at the end of this hour also. But that is one of the tools you can use that actually is quite useful and relatively simple, because if you have a structure that's not being used, it may be that you just need to funnel animals in there, and fencing can do that. It's not a perfect fix, but if you have a structure that is otherwise suitable, then a fence can probably increase the use of that structure at a relatively low cost, depending on the fence. And then the last one is to improve the characteristics of the structures. So you can do that by, for example, in the case of the rocks here. Oh, that's not showing up very well. Can we reduce the lights a little bit? I don't know if you can see that, but it's a series of rocks that have been placed along the side of a culvert, and it provides a dry walking space so that, and there's even animals that like to follow along creeks will still like sometimes to walk on a dry substrate. That might be a little too bright. I don't know what I look like, but it's probably something like a ghost. Besides what, I can't read it now, so maybe a little bit lighter. Okay, so another version of doing that is a little more engineering involved, but to make a kind of push some of the abutment material up and then make a dry pathway. And another, sometimes we don't think about these as in terms of helping how existing structures might be, but what if we actually turn it from a road and into a wildlife passage? You know, there is a case in Southern California now where this is actively being done. It's a very expensive project because it was put in for traffic, but it is being done because it was an important wildlife area. And this is a very interesting approach, and this is a bunch of rocks, boulders, and stumps of trees with a little bit of soil and grass and other vegetation that's been planted on an existing rural overpass. So it's a farm to market kind of a road that goes from two rural sides of the road and not used by vehicles very much. So they decided, how about if we make it useful for small animals? And by putting in what we call furniture, that provides some cover for smaller species, and it actually works very well. And you can do this also on larger structures where you put the furniture inside of a much larger culvert, and you will get more use by small species that require cover. Okay, so that's some retrofitting ideas, and there's a lot more, and this is where if you guys can come up with new ideas, that's where you can really make a difference. There is so much room in the field of transportation ecology to make a positive difference with your creativity. So, you know, have at it. Think of new things. You probably hadn't thought about putting stumps and boulders on an overpass and making it a pathway for wildlife. Somebody thought of that. Somebody else probably said, that's a really stupid idea, you know, right? But it works. So be creative. Try stuff. Some of it won't work, some of it will. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the actions that are intended to affect the behavior of drivers. And we've actually found that affecting driver behavior is a little bit harder than affecting wildlife behavior. So this hasn't worked out real well so far, but it's got some promise, and there are some other benefits of it. So these actions are in some ways also intended to change the way that people view wildlife, so how they perceive the issue of wildlife and highways, perceive the danger and so forth of running into an animal, but also to affect the way that they see the value of wildlife and why it's not a good social idea to just run over them. So that increasing their awareness of animals on the road and around it is part of that benefit. And one of the ways you can do this is with public education. And we can put up kiosks and signs. Certainly, I've seen it with some of the stuff that we see right in this building now. Those are ways to affect the public. And as far as what we know about the effectiveness, it's a long-term thing. We don't have a really good idea, a good measure of whether it's effective. It's not necessarily very costly, but it could be, depending on what kind of a program you have. So it's a long-term vision. It's not likely to make a change in any given segment of highway. This is, however, with signs, intended to make a difference in one section, at least, of a highway or a road. It's not just on paved surfaces. It can be on gravel roads, too. And in this case, it's unfortunately, this is one of those cases where it doesn't cost very much, but as far as we can tell, it also doesn't help very much. There are some situations where signage does help, but just the basic idea of putting a sign out, you might actually think of it more as that public education function instead of mitigation for, reducing the collision rate, because so far we don't have a whole lot of evidence that has been effective. With variable message signs, and these are ones that because they change each time, drivers are not as likely to ignore them. And so these signs have a little bit better effectiveness than the ones that are there all the time that people see or don't see. So it's a little bit better. They're also, of course, more expensive than just plain old signs, but they can help. They still have relatively low effectiveness and relatively low cost. How about speed reduction? Well, boy, there's a lot of, let's say, disagreement on this. I can't tell you how many papers, scientific papers I've read where the entire discussion has nothing to do with speed, and then in the discussion, all of a sudden the authors say, well, the fix to this problem of wildlife vehicle collisions is to reduce driver speed. And it's like, well, you didn't really investigate that in your paper. And it is an assumption that reducing driver speed will reduce the collision collision probability. It needs to be separated between the probability of a collision and the severity of a collision. The faster you go when you hit something, the harder it will hurt. But with wildlife, it's not yet really very solidly looked at whether or not a reduced speed will actually help. So I would personally suggest that if that's one of your recommendations, unless you're talking in an area where you have a national park where people are going to, or a wildlife refuge where people are actually going for the purpose of watching the animals and they want to see them and they do not want to drive over them, and if they're driving about 45 miles per hour, and I can't remember what that equates to in kilometers per hour. That seems to be a threshold where that does make a difference. At that lower level, then a lot of species, particularly birds, can move fast enough to avoid a collision. But of course, those non-responders will not. So remember those non-responders? I just talked about that before lunch. Okay. Again, this is relatively low effectiveness insofar as we know. But usually it doesn't cost very much, although, again, we don't have a lot of good data, in fact, pretty bad data to show that. Another general system, which is really new, relatively new technology, and it's still being improved and not used in a huge number of places yet, and that is systems which basically warn drivers that animals are immediately in front of them, or enough to where they will have to pay attention. Usually what that means is that the signs will light up when there's an animal in the road right ahead, and that is determined by some sort of remote sensing where an animal, this is one way, an animal will break an infrared beam and that will trigger a sign or a warning, and then drivers then are, and this is the trick here, drivers are expected to act appropriately with that information. Of course, we don't know what that is. I don't know about other countries, but in the U.S., I have never heard anything in driver's training that says, well, you know, if you are about to run into an animal, you should A, swerve off the road, B, hit it, or C, slam on your brakes and get rear-ended by the car in back of you. You know, so this is one of, it may be obvious, one of my pet peeves about it. But at any rate, this system in some cases has been shown to be quite effective. So it's worth looking at and trying. It, like I say, it's a new technology, relatively new, and so we can learn more about it. And this is best on large species in more open habitats. Doesn't work on turtles. You know, so there's a lot of, doesn't work on monkeys, you know, so there's a lot of things that you can't use it for. And then there's some imaging, thermal imaging technology that is potentially useful. We don't really know whether that's going to work or not, but it's been started to be used. Okay, and these two techniques, that is clearing the road edge and also lighting it at night, are intended to help drivers see larger species so that, again, they're supposed to figure out what they're supposed to do with that information. Typically, they will try to either slow down or avoid them. Sometimes that avoiding will kill them also. That is, driving across the road, avoiding a turkey or something, which I know of one person who was killed that way. It would have been better to hit the turkey, right? Anyway, back to these methods. The clearing of vegetation also doesn't have great studies. There's probably, in my opinion, the best one is one on moose and railroads, which doesn't totally apply to a lot of cases, but in that case, they have found some cases where the moose would actually not get quite as close to the rails. But that's also an area of not only future research is needed, but it's also a situation where if you have a clearing along a road, you have now increased the barrier effect for those species which require cover. So consider that. Lights, I personally think lights are a really bad idea because they're, for nocturnal species, it's just, okay. I am not convinced that that's a good thing to do. It may decrease collision somewhat, but again, we don't have a whole lot of, I don't think we have any information, we have very little information on it. But they're relatively low cost. Okay, so then there's actions that are centered around wildlife and intend to change the way that wildlife work with the highway and also vehicles. So this is back to this kind of clearing thing where if you are reducing the attraction of the roadsides, then wildlife will be less likely to go there. Again, that increases the barrier effect. There are a number of repellent types of ideas, and most of these simply do not work. And if they do work, then the likelihood that animals will habituate to them and the effectiveness would reduce is great. One of the, I think the best example of this are reflectors, which are these structures here, and the people who have invented these have been very, very good at selling them, but in general, they're not in general. They don't work for even if they're maintained properly. They still have their problems, and they're not all that cheap either. There are a number of other ways of repelling wildlife away from the road. You can, or any other thing like your garden, but so far we haven't found that these are very useful either. Okay, so then excuse me, then we have to look at some, now we're getting into the more costly situations. And in the case of overpasses and underpasses, you're basically excluding wildlife from the road itself, which keeps them away from cars. Now, we do this for people all the time. On our field trip, you will see a number of overpasses for people, for pedestrians across busy highways. There's not a lot of difference in the whole concept here. It's keeping the objects that will kill things away from the things that can be killed. So, you know, it's not difficult conceptually. Okay, so here are a number of examples of this. There are both overpasses and underpasses. So overpasses are where wildlife crosses over the road, and underpasses are where wildlife crosses under the road. Sometimes there's a confusion about that terminology. It depends on your perspective. When we talk about it, we're talking about it from the perspective of wildlife. But sometimes, especially if you talk with engineers, that can be a source of confusion. So try to clarify that before you get too far into a conversation, because you might be talking really different things and you don't know it. And these can be in just all kinds of forms. Here are 4 examples of overpasses with very different types of substrates on the top. And not surprisingly, different levels of acceptance by the species that they were intended to serve. This one even has a pond on top of it, a tiny pond, and that was intended to allow sort of stepping stones for amphibians across a multiple lane highway. And then we have underpasses, and in the terminology that most transportation ecologists use, when we say underpasses, that includes bridges and culverts. I think we're calling alcantarillas culverts, right, Gordon? Yeah, okay. And puentes. So both of those are under, wildlife passes under the road. And there are a million different varieties of this. This one on the left is showing tiny, tiny little toads. I love this picture. There's about, I don't know, a jillion of them in there. And the one on the right is an open top structure, which allows for air and moisture and light to come in at the same level that the traffic is. That's got its pros and cons, but it's useful in some cases. And these are two more views of that same type of structure. And again, there's many types, but this is the one that you'll find most often is underpasses that are culverts. They can be cement or they can be a number of different types of materials. Most commonly cement or corrugated metal pipe that are used for wildlife anyway. And another type is bridges that are actually connecting the canopy. And for those of you in Mesoamerica, South America, this is an area where you can make a huge contribution to the science, because we need to try and make better and more arboreal bridges. There's so many species that, as Tony mentioned, you know, the forests here are very, very dense, and so that means that the species there are going to be more adapted to staying in the trees, and especially at the tops of trees. So arboreal bridges are attempts to cross from one tree to the next. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. We need more research on this. One of the things we were just talking about yesterday in our field trip reconnaissance was to try to think whether, well, it looks like maybe if they're too long, that means that some species at least will not accept them. So how can we fix that? And there are some ways you can contribute to knowing that. Okay, fences to divert flying animals, which can be anything from butterflies to bats to birds, pelicans, barn swallows, all kinds of things. And these are bridges that are, or poles that are designed to increase the height of the flying individual over the top of the traffic. Another area ripe for research, although we do have some examples of very effective situations. How about using fencing without passage structures? How does that work? Well, as you might guess, it actually decreases the mortality, but it increases the problem of permeability. So it's not a complete fix there. And sometimes that can be very deadly for some species that are that have a high motivation to move across the landscape, because they're so intent to move that they will die because they keep trying or get caught in the fences. Okay, one technology that is still kind of emerging is the idea of electrical in the ground structures. And the idea there, is to electrify a certain part of the road, so that at the end of a fence that animals don't go around and go back into the road because they don't like to be electrocuted. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it that way, because it's not a jolt that will kill animals. It's just enough. It's like if you touch an electric fence, you don't touch an electric fence ever again. You know, you do it once, that's it. And that's the same thing. There's an image of an elk that's just learning that. Okay, and so there are escape structures that we've been kind of trying out for a few years now, and this actually works. Well, this particular slide is looking at what if you had escape structures and fences without crossing structures, and in that case, it does help to keep animals off the road that get into the roadway if you have fences, and some of them work really, really well, and some of them work better for some species than others. There's a number of different designs. Okay, now we get to the stuff that does work really well, and that is passages for wildlife that are combined with suitable fences appropriate for your target species and escape ramps. All three of them combined have been shown to be the most effective mitigation measure to both reduce animal vehicle collisions and to maintain habitat connectivity. So this is the gold standard. Now, unfortunately, the gold standard comes with a high cost. Amazing how that works. But at any rate, if you design a structure that is suitable for the species that you're targeting, then it is highly likely that you will both reduce collisions and maintain connectivity. We have examples now across the world where this is the case. And they can be very small for small species or big for big species. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next one. When you do implement these structures, especially new ones, and if you try some new things out, it would be a really good idea to see whether what you tried is working or not. And also put into place some mechanism where if it's not working the way that you intend it to work, then you have some way to change it, improve it, so that it does work better. So you can evaluate the effectiveness. Tony's going to talk a lot about this, so I'm going to run through this. But basically, evaluating the effectiveness depends on what your definition of effectiveness is. That could be a reduction in a collision rate. It could be an increase in the movement of your target species. So that needs to be defined. But basically, you can evaluate that with good scientific methods. And then you want to adjust what you did. So here's a really quick case study where on this highway, they found that the fence was not really working to keep the wildlife focused onto the structure, under the structure that they wanted them to go on. They were still having some collisions. And so people got together, they were collecting data, and then they decided, oh, well, it looks like this fence is not working the way that we wanted it to. And so they fixed the fence. And then lo and behold, after they fixed the fence, not only did more animals go through the structure, but they had a reduced collision rate. So that's a good example of where they used their monitoring to determine what they needed to do to improve. Okay, so there's that one. And next one is back to using behavior again, or MECL. Let's see. Where are we?
I think we're in here. We have like 20 minutes.
Okay, so this is another one that my good friend and colleague Julia and I have worked on, and we have a paper along with Patty Kramer that is on this concept. So we're, in this case, what we're trying to do is gather up all of the knowledge that we have about when wildlife have decided to cross the road. And we have we know that we can do some kind of structure to help them across. How are we going to make that match? Okay, so can we use behavior to help us to determine what type of structure we would use, and not all the things that Tony was talking about, not the location and that, the pre-planning, but more into the what type of structure are they likely to use? I'm not going to get into we need one that's 1 meter wide by, 1 meter tall. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how to use behavior so that if you don't have any evidence so far that the species that you're concerned about can or will use crossing structures, what would you do in that case? And this is a conceptual framework that might help you to think about what questions you would ask to get to that answer. Okay, so one thing we know is that different species use different types of structures. They don't all like the same stuff. And that's not all that surprising because they have very different threats, they have different predators, they have different body sizes, they have different movement types. So how can we use those characteristics to design better structures? And in this case, especially the idea of threat avoidance or risk avoidance is an extremely useful concept because animals are adapted to whatever threats their environment has. So if we can make it as easy and comfortable for them to use their adaptations so that we're not fighting against those adaptations, but we're actually using them to encourage them to use structures that we're designing for them. So we also need to take into account the conditions that are necessary for certain habitat specialists. And certainly we need to pay attention to their mode of movement, how fast they travel, what way they travel, what they like to travel by, next to, whether they like open spaces or whether they are comfortable with enclosure. In fact, whether they prefer closure. Some type of covering, and any restrictions that they have based on their bodies. So for this concept, we've looked at about 6 different structure types, and these are very general types, and there's lots of different sizes. But in general, we're small underpass, large underpass, or excuse me, small underpass, medium underpass, large underpass, viaduct, which is a very large one, wildlife overpass, and then arboreal bridges. So these have certain what we, my colleagues and I have come up with in terms of specific definitions for what these categories are, and this will help to tie in with the guilds in a little bit here. So I mentioned each of these, and I'll go through this. So the first type is a small underpass. And generally, when we talk about a small underpass, we're talking about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. So it can be round, it can be square, but generally the size is the issue. It might have water in it, might not have water in it. The next one is also an underpass, but it's a medium-sized underpass. And that can be a bridge or it can be a culvert. The next one we're calling a large underpass, and the difference between those is, and at least for North America, but I think the concept can be expanded further, this is the one where we've sort of defined as the deer species that we have in North America will use. And if it's large enough for a deer to accept, then that is a category of a large structure. And then, and of course, it starts at that size and gets bigger. But when you get to a viaduct, that's where you have a very large span that includes vegetation underneath. It's an underpass. It's a bridge that has multiple, or a lot of space underneath it. Usually and hopefully with vegetation. Overpasses can be actually relatively small, but most of the ones that are built in at least North America these days are rather large. They can, they're generally they are very large because we know that the very large ones work and that they can support soil on top and sometimes ponds. So, that's something that can be very useful for species that otherwise wouldn't use a crossing structure. And then the last category are those arboreal bridges where you have glider poles or canopy bridges that grow across it. Okay, so what can we use this concept for? Guilds are species that, or groups of species that do something in common, even if they're not closely related. So we have coined the term wildlife crossing guilds to define these types. And we generally looked at all the literature that we could find on how wildlife use crossing structures. And they fell into pretty much 8 groups, actually 7 groups and a miscellaneous. There was a category where, they were just too individualized to really say. But for the majority of species, you can actually put them into 8 groups. And of those 8 groups, they turn out to be dependents or obligates, and those really require specific conditions all the way through a structure, whether that's on top or otherwise. And generalists, which are the easy guys, those are the ones that they will accept almost everything. And as long as their body can fit through it, they're good, they're okay. Those are the really easy ones. And then there's the specialists that really have very narrowly specialized physiology or movement capabilities, and they really have very extremely specialized needs. So of the dependents, there are types that require greater visibility, lots of visibility. Those that require the opposite, they require cover. And the last are ones that we call semi-aquatics, which means the ones that like to travel next to waterways, not in the water. So we're not talking fish, we're talking animals that like to go next to water. Those that are in the water, the aquatic organisms, that's a different topic altogether. Related, but I'm not talking about it. And then the generalists, there's 2 types generally. Ones that have larger bodies, like larger structures, ones that are medium-bodied, and they will accept smaller structures. And then the specialists, I told you that there is a group kind of like the miscellaneous group, and that's the ones that have unique conditions that you have to design for that species. The arboreal crossings and the aerial species. So we even have actually permeability issues with some flying species, bats and birds, some insects. We've actually done crossing structures for insects. I've been involved with butterfly crossings, and that's an interesting thing. Okay, so now we're getting into the guild characteristics and what types of structures they might accept. So the species that require cover, or cover specialists, for them their characteristics are that they really need to have cover in order to feel safe that they're not going to be predated upon by their predators, or they may need to have cover so that they don't dry out. Amphibians would be in that category. There's other reasons why they might need cover, but they don't usually go places that don't have the cover that they need. An example of this would be, have any of you heard of the Australian species that likes rock piles? This was an early example of an application of this way before we thought of it. Okay, tell me what the species is. I'm having we'll think of it. Pygmy possum, rock pygmy possum. Yeah. Okay, so this rock pygmy possum needed to get across the highway, but was not going to cross it over that open span. Remember that some species are really hindered by the the surface. Okay, well, so the people who knew what these pygmy possums needed, which was the cover of the rock, they actually built an underpass with its rock coverings, and they used it, and it was really a great example of that. So, and of course, that's part of how we know that there are some categories of things that species need. So, is it from the work of creative people who knew something about their species. Okay, so the types of generally these are smaller species, but they can accept small underpasses. That's why I want to give you a hint here. In this series of slides, the one that is highlighted are the structure types that group will accept in one form or another. So even if you have a very large structure, such as an overpass or a large underpass, if you put the kind of cover there that your target species likes, then it will still be considered working. So, for example, the furniture that I showed, the stumps and the boulders and stuff, that's an example of putting cover in to a larger structure. But if you have a smaller structure, like a very small culvert, sometimes you may not need that. Sometimes you do. Here's some examples of species that require cover and what types of structures they've used. This is this right here. It's not showing up super clearly, but this is a long-tailed weasel. And in this structure, we've placed a lot of boulders and stumps, and this is where we always find them. And there's a whole bunch of other small species that have used that part of the structure. These guys are picas. They're another one that likes lots of talus slopes, rock slopes. Okay, all right. Next one is a species that require long distance visibility. So this is kind of the opposite of that. And in this case, these are the species that want to see where their predators are coming from, and they want a lot of space to be able to escape from those predators, and they want maneuvering room, so they want to see and avoid their predators, and they want to do it with a large distance. In this case, really those large viaducts and overpasses are really what you're aiming for, because if they really like very large open spaces, then the most comfortable type of structure that they're going to use is one where the visibility is very large. Now, sometimes you can make underpasses that are large underpasses, as the slide shows here, suitable depending on your species and its actually physical size. But the best version of this is the viaducts where habitat goes continuously under the bridge, or overpasses where you can reconstruct the habitat on top of it. Some examples of this, I don't know if the news of this type of the Wyoming pronghorn herd and the Trapper Point overpass has reached you folks, but it was a really affirming situation for us transportation ecologists, because it was built to maintain the longest migratory pathway in the United States anyway, and pronghorn were really being fragmented. As soon as the underpass or overpass was completed, that fall, within I think it was days, pronghorn started to use it, and it's only been in there now. I think this is the third or fourth year, probably fourth year, I guess, and they're just using it all the time. That seems to be the case with most of the overpasses. Even sometimes we have birds that like open areas, including sage grouse. Whoops, sorry. Whoa, okay. These are sage grouse, which are large gallinaceous birds that live in open sage country, and they seem to like a large underpass. They're okay with that. They can see through it. Okay, the next group are those that walk alongside but don't get into, or at least don't travel in the water. And those are semi-aquatics. And in that case, basically you want to make sure that there's some sort of dry substrate that's next to the water that they're trying to walk along. And a lot of our water conveyance structures, like bridges and culverts, suit that, but many of them, and we'll see some of these on our field trip, have water from basically one side of the structure to the other, which essentially makes it to where these guys are having a harder time getting across there. So what we want to do then in this case is make sure that there is some dry substrate so that they can easily go past. And some of these species actually are very associated with water in terms of, like, otters swim, obviously, and, you know, so do turtles, wood ducks also swim. So it's not like these species are against water, you know, they don't have anything against water, but what they are trying to do is travel in a more rapid and quiet way than traveling in the water. Sometimes they'll get in the water and travel also, but you want to give them the opportunity to travel in the way that they are most adapted to. Okay, and then we get into the two groups of species that are the easy ones to get along with. And you'll see in this graphic, lo and behold, they basically, you know, they'll use just about anything that they can fit in. So in this case, let's see here. Okay. Trying to make sure I am reading my Spanish correctly here. So the medium-sized structure specialists, these are not medium-sized animals. These are specialists for medium-sized structures and larger. In this case, these are the absolute most adaptive species. These are the raccoons, the possums of the world, you know, where you put in a structure or even an existing structure and they're going to use it unless you actively make it hard for them to use it. So you don't really have to do too much with these. They're there. You're going to, you know, you're going to do a lot of good for them just by having any structure there. And this actually, interestingly, can include some species, even like bears, black bears. I have, it's not in here, but I have a picture of a black bear that literally is in a structure that he had to squeeze through. You know, it's like he fills up the entire culvert. And so that, you know, it says, yeah, I'll cross the road that way instead of getting hit by a car. And then you have the other group of adaptable species, which are just slightly less adaptable, but that's mainly because they have larger body sizes and they aren't going to fit in some of the smaller structures. So in this case, we've got deer are fortunately very adaptable, and a lot of other species, they may prefer certain types, but they are, generally speaking, much more adaptable than some of the specialists. They do like, usually, good visibility in the structure and through the structure, and as with actually virtually all species, they prefer natural substrate on the bottom, and generally wider rather than tall structures. And here's some great examples. Okay, and then we get to the miscellaneous category. And these are ones that we just can't put into any of these other categories to make it simpler. We have to know enough about that species' special needs so that we can accommodate it. And in some cases, we can actually place amphibians in that category because they really require ambient conditions that will not dry them out, will not heat them up too much, and you know, so they are pretty picky that way. But there are some other species that are way different than that. I don't know, how many of you have seen the Christmas island crab crossing? Ooh, none of you have seen, okay, just a couple of you. Let me explain this. Okay, these are crabs, this size, okay? Google on Christmas crab crossing, and you'll find this. And what these guys do is they migrate in mass to and from the ocean to lay their eggs, and so they have, they're non-responders. They just cross everything, and of course, when they cross the road, then it's unavoidable for drivers to just smash jillions of them. That's a technical term, by the way. Am I giving my translator a hard time by saying jillions? That means a lot. Okay. So this structure is rather simple and clever. It's something that they can grab onto and cross the road. And it also has a fence, by the way, a diversion fence there. So these are, okay, I'm running out of time here. I think I'm getting pretty close, though. Okay, so the next group, I've already mentioned how important you are to finding out more about arboreal crossings, but we really don't know a whole lot about these yet. So what we do know is that there are species that don't like to go to the ground, or when they do, they're in really great danger. So, or they only go to the ground for a specific purpose for a very short period of time, and generally speaking, they would prefer to be traveling through the treetops. This can be, I know we're talking about monkeys and various other mammals, arboreal mammals here on our field trip, but there's also snakes and other species that are in this category. So this is something you guys will have to help us to do. And I think, so this is from Costa Rica. And this is a flying squirrel that we have. This is a different type of an arboreal crossing, but it's the same kind of idea, where an animal that typically wants to stay up high and not go on the ground will actually glide across from tree to tree. These work, by the way. This was one of those creative ideas that when the person who invented it brought it up, everybody said, yeah, right, I don't think we're going to do this. And as it turns out, the southern flying squirrel is a U.S. federally listed endangered species. So the Fish and Wildlife Service was able to, by mandate, convince the DOT to put them in, and they work. Who knew? Okay, and then the last category are those specialists that want to stay above the road. They want to stay flying. But sometimes, you think that, okay, this is, really, do we need crossing structures for animals that fly? Birds, bats, bugs? Well, the answer is sometimes yes, because there are, especially with bats, we know that bats will use underpasses. You wouldn't really expect that, but they do. They would prefer to cross under the highway where those structures are large enough that they will use them. And this is apparently species specific, but we know that they do prefer to cross through underpasses rather than cross over and get into the traffic. Actually, some bats are avoiders of traffic volume, to incorporate that concept yet again. Another method of this is to put up poles where this is an impression of a fence. It's not actually a barrier. Well, the one on the left is actually a fence, but the one on the right are just poles. And in that case, what was happening is royal terns and brown pelicans were flying over the bridge, and then because of the wind direction and the way that it was hitting the bridge, it would cause a downdraft, which meant that the birds that thought they were flying high enough when they were aiming at the bridge were pushed down into the traffic as soon as they got on top of the bridge, and had a lot of mortalities of both those species. So they put up these poles. They were intending to put up a fence, but the bridge maintenance guys said, no, we can't maintain the bridge very well with a chain link fence there. So just put the poles up. And the Florida State Park Service said, well, I don't know if that's going to work, but we'll try it. Well, apparently it formed a perception of a barrier, and from a distance, when the birds saw these poles, they perceived it as something that they had to fly higher in order to clear. Well, once they flew higher to clear the poles, they were also flying high enough so that they avoided that downdraft that pushed them into traffic. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, okay. This will be in your in the slides. So, but it's a way to kind of go. It's a flow chart that sort of helps to figure out what your species might be, your target species. And I think I'll skip those. Yeah, and my fence presentation, I guess, will not be done right now. We'll talk about fences and